The sound was not loud. That was the first thing everyone noticed. It was not the chaos of a machine gun or the panic of multiple shots echoing down the block. It was a single, precise crack. Clean, deliberate, cutting through the Harlem night like a judge's gavel. One sound, one decision. And in that instant, an era that had survived decades of police raids, mob pressure, and whispered betrayals quietly came apart. Men froze where they stood. Cards slipped from hands. A glass tipped over and shattered, the sound oddly louder than the gunshot itself. Somewhere down the street, a saxophone kept playing, ignorant of the line that had just been crossed. Bumpy Johnson did not move. He stood beneath the bare bulb hanging from the club's low ceiling, hat brim casting a shadow over eyes that had seemed too much to be surprised anymore. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't bark orders. He simply listened, to the echo fading, to the sudden silence of men who had once sworn loyalty without hesitation. The body on the floor belonged to someone Harlem knew. And that was the problem. Because when that sound cracked through the night, it wasn't just a man who went down. It was secrecy. It was trust. It was the unspoken agreement that Bumpy Johnson's inner circle was untouchable, sealed tighter than any vault in the city. By morning, everyone would be asking the same question in hushed tones. Who let that sound happen? And by the time the truth surfaced, Harlem would never look at power the same way again. Long before that night, Bumpy Johnson had become something more than a man. In Harlem, he was a constant, a presence, a fixed point in a world where everything else shifted with the seasons. Police captains rotated, politicians made promises they didn't keep, and Italian bosses came and went. But Bumpy remained. He walked the streets like he belonged to them because, in many ways, he did. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Harlem existed in a strange tension, alive with culture, music, and ambition, yet suffocating under surveillance and neglect. Jazz poured out of basement clubs. Numbers runners worked corners like clockwork. Churches preached dignity while cops enforced humiliation. And somewhere in the middle stood Bumpy Johnson, navigating a balance no one else could hold for long. He wasn't just an enforcer. That was the mistake outsiders made. Bumpy understood contracts better than most lawyers. He understood respect better than most politicians. He knew when to apply pressure, and when restraint carried more power than violence ever could. Italian mob bosses learned early that Harlem was not a territory you conquered. It was one you negotiated with. And you negotiated through Bumpy. His inner circle reflected that philosophy. These were not reckless gunmen or loudmouths chasing headlines. They were men who understood silence. Men who knew how to move money without drawing eyes, how to handle disputes without leaving bodies, how to protect Harlem's interests while keeping the wolves, police and mob alike, at bay. Loyalty was the currency that mattered most, and for years, that loyalty held. But loyalty, like power, attracts attention. As Bumpy's influence solidified, so did the pressure around him. Law enforcement grew frustrated watching cases evaporate. Informants turned up dead or disappeared. Judges dismissed charges that should have stuck. And behind closed doors, captains and commissioners admitted what they'd never say publicly. Harlem was being run, and they weren't the ones doing it. So they changed tactics. Instead of attacking Bumpy directly, they aimed inward, quietly, patiently. They watched who entered his circle and who left it, who drank too much, who owed too much, who felt overlooked, underpaid, or underappreciated. The police didn't need Bumpy to make a mistake. They just needed someone close to him to do it instead. Inside the inner circle, cracks formed the way they always do, subtly, invisibly at first. A man passed over for a role he thought he deserved. Another pressured by debts he couldn't explain. A third who believed he was indispensable. Until he wasn't. Bumpy saw some of it. He always did. But even legends have blind spots, especially when trust has been earned over years, not days. The man who would later end up on that floor had been there through police crackdowns and mob negotiations. He had eaten at Bumpy's table. He had spoken in meetings where only the most trusted voices were allowed. He knew routes, names, numbers, details that never left the room, which made that single gunshot more than an act of violence. It made it a signal. By dawn, whispers traveled faster than patrol cars. The Italians heard first, then the numbers bankers, then the cops. A question echoed through precincts and back rooms alike. If someone that close could fall, what else was exposed? Bumpy understood the stakes before anyone else dared say them out loud. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. This was about containment. Because when the sound of one gunshot tells the world that the inner circle can be breached, the legend himself becomes the next target. By rivals, by law enforcement, and by men who suddenly start thinking survival might mean choosing the winning side. The era of quiet control was over, and the challenge ahead wasn't just to punish betrayal, but to redefine what loyalty meant when everyone was listening. Bumpy Johnson lifted his eyes from the body on the floor and looked at the men still standing. None of them spoke. None of them moved. They were waiting, and for the first time in years, they weren't sure which direction safety lay. By sunrise, Harlem wore a different face. The streets were the same. Brick buildings, iron fire escapes, storefront churches opening their doors. But the rhythm underneath had shifted. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar footsteps passed. Eyes lingered longer than usual. Men who once moved with confidence now measured every block like it might be their last safe one. News of the gunshot had traveled without names, without details, but with unmistakable weight. Something had gone wrong inside Bumpy Johnson's house. And when something went wrong inside Bumpy's house, the consequences never stayed contained. Bumpy spent the morning alone in his apartment, seated near the window that overlooked the street he'd walked since boyhood. He did not pace. He did not rage. He read the morning paper, folded neatly, untouched coffee cooling beside him. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like routine. But inside his mind, pieces were being arranged. The man who died hadn't been careless. That much was clear. No loose talk, no drunken mistakes, no obvious provocations. The killing had been efficient, surgical, meant to end something quietly, not start a war. That narrowed the possibilities. Someone had wanted him silent, and someone had known exactly how dangerous his voice could become. Bumpy didn't need reports to know what law enforcement would do next. He'd seen the pattern too many times. The police wouldn't rush in with raids or headlines. Not yet. First would come the visits, the polite questions, the casual stops, the just checking in conversations designed to unsettle men already questioning their footing. Pressure works best when applied slowly. By mid-morning, Bumpy's people confirmed what he already suspected. A vice squad captain had been spotted near one of their smaller operations. An unmarked car idled too long on 135th. A familiar detective, one known for turning men quietly rather than breaking them loudly, had been seen talking to someone who shouldn't have been talking to anyone. The circle was being tested. Inside a back room above a bar that had survived prohibition by pretending it never closed, Bumpy gathered his remaining inner circle. The room smelled of stale smoke and old wood. No music, no drinks poured. Just men seated around a scarred table that had witnessed decisions most courts would never hear about. Bumpy took his time before speaking. "You all know why we're here," he said calmly. No one responded. They didn't need to. "The sound last night," Bumpy continued, his voice even, "told a lot of people things they weren't supposed to hear." Eyes dropped, a jaw tightened. One man shifted in his chair, then went still. Bumpy let the silence work. Silence always revealed more than shouting ever could. "That man on the floor," he said, "was family. Not by blood, but by choice." He paused, letting the word choice hang. Which means what happened to him didn't start with a gun. That was when the tension truly set in, because everyone in that room understood the implication. Guns were tools. Decisions were the real weapons. And somewhere, before the shot, before the body hit the floor, a decision had been made that put all of them at risk. One of the men finally spoke, carefully. "You think he talked?" Bumpy turned his head slowly, eyes settling on the speaker, not accusing, not angry, just focused. "I think," Bumpy said, "that somebody wanted to make sure he never could." That answer landed heavier than any accusation. If the man had already been cooperating, killing him made no sense. It would only draw attention. But if he might talk, if pressure was closing in and cracks were forming, then silencing him was an act of desperation. Which raised the real question. Desperation from whom? Over the next few days, Harlem felt like a chessboard with too many hands reaching for the pieces. The Italians pulled back slightly, not out of fear, but calculation. They didn't want to be caught in the middle of an internal reckoning. The numbers runners tightened their roots. Money moved faster, quieter, and the police watched it all. Captain O'Leary, an old-school officer who believed Harlem had been allowed to get ideas, made his move quietly. No raids, no warrants, just conversations. He let it be known that he was willing to listen, that protection was possible, that certain men didn't have to go down with the ship if they chose wisely. He used the same word over and over. Opportunity. Bumpy learned O'Leary's name from 3 different sources before noon on the second day. That alone told him everything he needed to know. When cops wanted something badly, they never shut up about it. But O'Leary wasn't interested in Bumpy. Not directly. He was interested in the men around him, and that was the real challenge. Because taking on the police was one thing. Bumpy had done it his entire life. But defending a circle when trust itself had become the battlefield, that required a different kind of authority. One built not on fear, but on clarity. That night, Bumpy walked Harlem alone. No entourage, no visible protection, just the legend moving through his territory, letting himself be seen. Shopkeepers nodded. Old women watched from stoops. Young men straightened when he passed. He wasn't hiding. He was reminding everyone, inside and outside his circle, who this all belonged to. From a car parked half a block away, Captain O'Leary watched through the windshield. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply observed a man who refused to retreat, even when the ground beneath him had shifted. O'Leary leaned back and said quietly to his driver, "That's not a man who doesn't know he's exposed." "No, sir," the driver replied. "That's a man deciding how many people are about to learn what exposure really costs." The challenge had been set, and soon, someone inside Bumpy Johnson's world would have to choose between survival and loyalty, without knowing which choice would actually keep them alive. Harlem did not explode into chaos the way outsiders expected. There were no sudden shootings, no dramatic raids, no bodies turning up in alleys. Instead, the neighborhood tightened in on itself, like a muscle bracing for impact. The absence of violence was not peace, it was restraint. And restraint, in Bumpy Johnson's world, was the most dangerous phase of all. Because restraint meant decisions were being made. Behind closed doors, men began to reassess their positions, who they stood with, who they trusted, who might be willing to trade one name for another if the pressure became unbearable. And the pressure was coming. Captain O'Leary made sure of that. Every morning, unmarked cars appeared where they didn't belong. Every afternoon, a known associate was stopped for a routine conversation. Sometimes it was polite. Sometimes it wasn't. But the message remained consistent. We know more than you think. One man in particular felt that message more sharply than the others. His name didn't carry the weight of Bumpy's, nor did it inspire fear in the way some of the older enforcers did. But he was essential. He handled logistics, who met whom, where money moved, which nights certain doors stayed open and others closed. He was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice, and that made him valuable. It also made him vulnerable. The police didn't grab him in the street. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they waited until he was alone, walking home through a stretch of Harlem that had grown quieter over the years. Two detectives stepped out of a car, coats neat, expressions almost friendly. They called him by his first name. That was how they always began. They spoke about small things at first, weather, family, how fast the neighborhood was changing. Then they spoke about the dead man, about how unfortunate it was, about how close he'd been to causing problems for a lot of people before someone decided to stop him. "You don't seem like that type," one detective said casually. "The type who'd let things get out of hand." The man said nothing. They didn't threaten him. They didn't promise him riches. They simply offered a future where he didn't have to carry the weight of someone else's legend on his shoulders. "All we're asking," the other detective said, "is for you to think about yourself for once." That night, the man didn't sleep. He replayed the gunshot in his mind, not the sound itself, but what it represented. How quickly someone trusted could be erased. How little warning there had been. How exposed everyone suddenly felt. He told himself he wasn't betraying anyone. Not yet. He wasn't giving names. He wasn't signing statements. He was just listening. Just surviving. That was how betrayal always began. Bumpy sensed the shift before anyone reported it. A missed meeting. A delay in information that normally arrived on time. A subtle change in how certain men held eye contact. He did not confront it immediately. Legends rarely act on suspicion alone. Instead, Bumpy tested the system. He altered routes, changed meeting times, fed small, harmless pieces of false information into the pipeline, and watched carefully to see where they surfaced. It didn't take long. Within 48 hours, Captain O'Leary adjusted patrol patterns in response to movements that were never supposed to be real. That was all the confirmation Bumpy needed. Someone was talking. But Bumpy didn't expose him. Not yet. Because exposure without understanding motive was just noise. And Bumpy needed clarity about who the man was protecting and how far he was willing to go. The next meeting of the inner circle was smaller, more selective. Bumpy spoke less. He listened more. When the man in question spoke, Bumpy watched how others reacted, not with suspicion, but with something closer to pity. The man was already alone. Days later, the police made their next move. They brought the man in, not for arrest, but for questioning. No cuffs, no holding cell, just a desk, a cup of coffee, and a captain who spoke as if they were equals. Captain O'Leary leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "most men like you don't get remembered. You keep the wheels turning, then you disappear when the engine breaks." The man swallowed. "But you," O'Leary continued, "you could walk away from this. Clean. You give us what we need, and Harlem stays quiet. Nobody else has to get hurt." "And if I don't?" the man asked. O'Leary smiled thinly. "Then you'll find out how loud things can get." That was the moment the man crossed the line, quietly, internally. He didn't sign anything. He didn't shake hands, but he agreed to talk. Slowly, carefully, just enough to stay alive. What he didn't know was that Bumpy had already decided how this would end, because loyalty, in Bumpy's world, wasn't just about silence. It was about responsibility. And when someone chose to protect themselves at the cost of everyone else, they forfeited the right to be protected in return. The night Bumpy called for him, the man knew something was wrong. The message was polite, respectful, a simple request to come by and talk. That was what scared him most. He arrived at a small apartment above a closed storefront. No guards visible, no raised voices. Just Bumpy sitting at a table, reading glasses in hand, a folder resting neatly beside him. "Sit," Bumpy said. The man obeyed. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "You know why the sound last week scared people?" The man shook his head. "Because it told them something they weren't ready to hear," Bumpy said. "That even inside the circle, choices still matter." He slid the folder across the table. Inside were dates, locations, patrol movements, proof that couldn't be explained away. "I didn't want it to be you," Bumpy said calmly. "But wanting don't change facts." The man's hands trembled. I didn't mean... Bumpy raised a hand, stopping him. Meaning ain't the same as doing. Silence filled the room. This wasn't a trial. It wasn't an interrogation. It was a reckoning. And whatever happened next would echo far beyond that room, into precincts, back rooms, and the streets of Harlem itself. The room did not feel like a place where men died. There were no weapons on the table, no raised voices, no guards posted at the door. Just a quiet apartment, a single lamp, and Bumpy Johnson seated across from a man whose life had already begun to collapse under the weight of his own choices. That was what made it unbearable. Bumpy closed the folder slowly, as if sealing more than paper inside it. He removed his glasses and set them beside the lamp with deliberate care. Every movement was measured, every second stretched. You ever notice, Bumpy said calmly, how folks think violence is the worst thing that can happen to them? The man said nothing. His throat was too tight to risk speech. They imagine fists, guns, blood, Bumpy continued. But that's just noise. Real damage happens quieter than that. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, not threatening, not looming, simply present. You didn't get pulled in, Bumpy said. You walked. The man finally looked up. His eyes were wet but defiant, like someone who had been cornered long enough to start believing resistance was all he had left. They were going to bury me, he said. You know that. Once the heat started, I'd have been the first name they dragged out. Bumpy nodded slightly. That's possible. And you'd have let it happen, the man pressed, desperation sharpening his voice. For the sake of the whole? Bumpy didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. I would have protected the house. The words landed hard, because the man finally understood the truth he'd been avoiding. In Bumpy's world, protection was earned by staying in line with something bigger than yourself. The moment he chose himself over the house, he stepped outside that protection. You didn't talk much, Bumpy continued. I'll give you that. But you talked enough. The man shook his head. I didn't give them names. You gave them patterns, Bumpy replied. And patterns get people killed. The silence that followed was not empty, it was final. Outside a car passed. Somewhere down the block, a door slammed. Life continued, indifferent to the reckoning happening inside that room. Bumpy stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically. He simply rose to his feet, buttoned his coat, and looked down at the man who had once sat beside him as an equal. There was a time, Bumpy said, when I'd have taken this outside, made an example. The man flinched. But that time's gone, Bumpy continued. Harlem's watching now. Police, too. They're waiting to see if I become what they say I am. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. I don't give them that satisfaction. Bumpy stepped back and nodded toward the door. You're going to leave. The man blinked, confused. Just leave? Yes, Bumpy said. You're going to walk out of here alive. Tonight. Relief flooded the man's face so quickly it almost made him dizzy. But don't mistake mercy for safety, Bumpy added. You don't belong here anymore. The man's relief faded. From this moment on, Bumpy continued, you don't work in Harlem. You don't speak on Harlem. You don't profit from Harlem. Every door you knew closes tonight. He paused. And the police you think you made a deal with? They won't protect you once you stop being useful. The man stood slowly, legs unsteady. You're just letting me go? Bumpy met his eyes. I'm letting you live with it. The man understood then. Death would have ended his fear. This would make it permanent. He turned toward the door, stopped once, and said quietly, They'll come after you harder now. Bumpy didn't look away. They already are. The door closed behind the man with a soft, unremarkable click. No gunshot, no sound. And yet, by morning, Harlem would know exactly what had happened, because Bumpy made sure of it. The next day, Captain O'Leary realized something had gone wrong. The man who'd been feeding him information stopped answering calls. Patrol patterns stopped lining up. Meetings that were supposed to happen didn't. It wasn't chaos, it was order returning to its rightful shape. And worse, the streets were calm. Too calm. O'Leary sat in his office, jaw tight, as reports filtered in. No retaliation, no violence, no mistakes. Just quiet. "That's not fear," O'Leary muttered. "That's discipline." He understood then what he'd underestimated. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just removed a weak link, he'd demonstrated control without bloodshed. He'd shown his people that loyalty wasn't enforced by terror, but by consequence. And he'd shown the police that their strategy had limits. O'Leary slammed his hand on the desk. "We lost him." Not just the informant, the moment. Because the story spreading through Harlem wasn't about betrayal, it was about restraint. About a man who could destroy someone and chose a punishment worse than death. Shopkeepers talked, musicians talked, numbers runners talked. The message carried itself without embellishment. Bumpy handled his business, and more importantly, he didn't let the cops turn him into a monster. Within weeks, the Italians resumed business as usual, but more carefully. They respected strength. They respected discipline even more. Law enforcement shifted focus, frustrated but cautious. And the man who'd walked out of that apartment? He left Harlem before the month was over. No one chased him. No one needed to. He carried the sound with him everywhere he went. Not the crack of a gun, but the silence that followed it. The silence of doors that never opened again. Of names that stopped meaning anything. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson resumed his place. Not louder, not harsher, but sharper. The era hadn't ended with a gunshot. It had ended with a decision, and everyone who mattered understood exactly what that meant. The streets of Harlem didn't celebrate. They rarely did when real power shifted. There were no parades, no public declarations, no bodies laid out as warnings. Instead, something subtler took place, something far more unsettling to those who watched Harlem from the outside. Order returned. Numbers operations resumed their quiet efficiency. Club owners stopped glancing nervously at the door. Messengers moved without doubling back. The kind of calm that followed wasn't relief. It was understanding. Everyone knew a line had been crossed, examined, and redrawn with precision. And everyone knew who had done it. Bumpy Johnson didn't announce the resolution. He didn't need to. His people understood the code. The absence of retaliation was the message. The lack of chaos told the story more clearly than any act of violence ever could. Justice, in Bumpy's world, wasn't about punishment for its own sake. It was about balance. Captain O'Leary felt that balance shift immediately. His informant was gone. His leverage evaporated. Worse still, the very tactic he'd used, pressure without confrontation, had been turned against him. The neighborhood he'd hoped to destabilize had instead tightened its internal discipline. That made O'Leary dangerous, because men like him didn't like being outplayed. He pushed for warrants that never materialized. Judges, wary of thin evidence, hesitated. Surveillance produced nothing actionable. The few remaining informants went silent, not out of fear, but certainty. They'd seen what happened to a man who tried to walk the line between survival and loyalty. The police hadn't lost a war. They'd lost momentum. And in Harlem, momentum was everything. Bumpy met with his circle again a week later. The room was fuller this time. Not crowded, just complete. The men seated around the table were quieter than before, more attentive. They didn't speak until spoken to. Bumpy didn't scold them. He didn't threaten them. He simply said, "What happens stays handled." That was all. But everyone in that room understood the deeper message. Loyalty wasn't assumed anymore. It was affirmed daily through action. The circle had been narrowed, not weakened. And what remained was stronger for it. Outside that room, the community responded in its own way. An older shop owner sent word that deliveries would be extended on credit again. A church deacon thanked Bumpy, not publicly, but sincerely, for keeping things steady. Musicians played later into the night, confident that trouble wouldn't spill in through the door. This was the kind of justice Harlem recognized. Not revenge, stability. The Italians took note as well. They'd seen enough leaders collapse under pressure to recognize the difference between survival and command. Bumpy's handling of the betrayal, bloodless, contained, definitive, earned a new level of respect. One mob intermediary summed it up bluntly in a private conversation. "That man doesn't panic. That's dangerous." For law enforcement, the lesson was harder to swallow. Captain O'Leary's superiors didn't scold him. They reassigned him. Quietly. Officially, it was a routine transfer. Unofficially, it was an acknowledgement that his approach had backfired. You didn't destabilize Harlem by pulling at loose threads. You strengthened it. The man who'd been exiled felt the consequences more deeply than anyone. In another city, far from Harlem, he tried to start over. He found work. He kept his head down. But the skills that once made him valuable, discretion, insight, connection, had no place outside the world he'd left behind. He wasn't hunted. He was irrelevant. And that, he realized too late, was the real punishment. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson walked the same streets he always had. But something about the way people looked at him had changed, not with fear, but with clarity. They understood now that the legend wasn't built on unchecked violence or reckless dominance. It was built on judgment, on the ability to know when to strike and when not to. That understanding reshaped the power dynamics in ways no police report could capture. Rivals hesitated longer before testing boundaries. Deals were honored more carefully. Words were chosen with more care in rooms where Bumpy's name might be spoken. Justice had been served, not by spectacle, but by consequence. And Harlem took note. Years later, men would argue about what truly made Bumpy Johnson untouchable. Some would say it was his fearlessness, the way he stared down mob bosses and police captains without raising his voice. Others would point to his intelligence, his understanding of power as something negotiated, not seized. But those who had lived through that moment, the sound that ended an era, knew the truth was more precise. It was judgment. Because that night marked the moment Bumpy Johnson stopped being measured only by what he could destroy, and became defined by what he chose to preserve. Harlem remembered. Not as gossip, not as rumor, but as lesson. The inner circle that survived became legendary in its own right. Smaller, quieter, sharper. Each man understood that proximity to Bumpy was not a shield. It was a responsibility. You carried the weight of the house, or you didn't carry anything at all. That understanding outlived police tactics, political shifts, and changing crime strategies. When younger men asked how Bumpy kept control without constant bloodshed, the answer was always the same. He made examples without making martyrs. The event entered Harlem's oral history the way all defining moments do. Retold in barbershops, whispered in back rooms, passed from old heads to young ones who needed to learn where the real lines were drawn. They spoke about the gunshot that wasn't followed by war, about the betrayal that didn't end in spectacle, about the man who walked away alive and lost everything that had ever given his life meaning. And they spoke about Bumpy, how he refused to let law enforcement dictate his response, how he denied them chaos, how he denied them a monster. That mattered. Because during that era, black power in America was constantly framed as something dangerous, something uncontrollable. Bumpy Johnson disrupted that narrative, not by submission, but by discipline. He showed that authority rooted in community could be stronger than authority imposed by force. Even the police learned from it, though few admitted it. After O'Leary's transfer, his replacement took a different approach, less provocation, more containment. Harlem was no longer viewed as a pressure point to be cracked open, but as a system that responded poorly to blunt instruments. That shift didn't come from policy. It came from experience. Italian mob leaders, too, adjusted their expectations. Negotiations became more formal. Lines were clarified and respected. Harlem was no longer treated as a variable. It was treated as a constant. Bumpy Johnson had achieved something rare. He turned a moment of vulnerability into a permanent elevation of status, and he did it without firing a shot. The legend that followed him after that night was quieter but heavier. Men listened more carefully when he spoke. Enemies calculated longer before acting. Allies understood that loyalty wasn't proven by words, it was proven by restraint under pressure. When historians later examined Harlem's criminal ecosystem during that period, they noticed something unusual. Fewer internal collapses than expected. Fewer informants. Fewer sudden implosions. The reason traced back to that moment, when one sound ended an era and replaced it with something stronger. Bumpy Johnson continued on, older now, more measured, but no less formidable. He had seen the cost of unchecked trust. He had felt the danger of exposure, and he had responded not with fear, but with clarity. That clarity became his legacy. Not the gun, not the violence, the decision. This story was never really about a gunshot. It was about what followed it. In a world that expected chaos, Bumpy Johnson chose control. In a moment designed to fracture his empire from the inside, he refused to let panic dictate his response. And by doing so, he revealed a truth that history often ignores. Real power doesn't rush. Real authority doesn't scream. And real legends don't need blood to prove who they are. When that sound cracked through the Harlem night, outsiders assumed it marked the beginning of the end. They waited for retaliation, for bodies, for headlines that would confirm every fear they already believed about men like Bumpy Johnson. What they got instead was silence. A silence that closed doors. A silence that ended careers. A silence that reminded everyone, police, rivals, and allies alike, that respect enforced by judgment lasts longer than fear enforced by violence. This wasn't just about one betrayal or one decision inside a dimly lit room. This was about a community watching its leader choose dignity over destruction. About a man refusing to let his enemies define him. About a legend proving that strength can be measured not only by what you take, but by what you refuse to give. Harlem remembered that lesson long after the players changed and the streets evolved. Because sometimes, the most powerful sound isn't the shot that echoes through the night. It's the quiet that follows, when everyone understands exactly who's still standing.